Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the worst insert cards of the 1960s. For the 1960s, it's a really interesting time. It's kind of like the second era behind the 1990s for really interesting cards. It was a really fun time because card collecting was coming into its own, and they were really kind of exploring and trying to understand not so much what they were going to be as much as different ways to interact with kids. And when you look at the main cards in the 1960s, the actual release cards, there's a wide range of different ideas they came up with. They were coming up with all sorts of stuff like really well-defined cards. They had wood designs on cards, they had TVs, all sorts of different ideas they played around with, and it makes it a lot of fun to explore that. But even more interesting was all the different inserts that they did. Because prior to 1960, there basically weren't inserts. It was really basic, and then all of a sudden, starting with 1960, they were putting inserts in almost every single set. Flair did some of this. Philadelphia really didn't, but for Topps, Topps was all over the map with these inserts. Some of them were just really exciting. They had things like rulers, and they had coins, they had stamps, they had so much different variety that they played around with, and some of these read really well, and others just didn't really read very well at all. But all of these were designed for kids. Everything about the 1960s was the world of kids, exploring how to interact with kids, interesting things to give kids. So you'd have stamps, stamps and coins were the big collectibles, and then card shops emerged out of coin shops and out of stamp shops. So in the 1960s, they made stamps for kids with players on it. Really cool idea. They had kind of like coins that they did, so kids had that. They had access to that. They weren't anything like the normal coins that you got, but they were their own little mini, they were almost like pins that just didn't have the pin on the back. So that was the fun of it. All these crazy ideas they were coming up with. And like I said, some of them landed really well, some not so much, but they were all intended for kids. And so for that time, they all did their job. They read well for the kids at the time as they opened up the packs, got them excited, and now here we are, a bunch of adults looking back, and I'm trying to understand, okay, so what ones are good and what ones are bad? Well, the thing is, they were all good at that time. So here we are now, we're more mature, we're supposed to be more mature, we've actually got some money, and so how well do these read? And that's what I'm really looking at. I'm looking at how well these inserts from the 1960s read today for collectibles. And so in some ways, I kind of hate to harp on them, but in other ways, some of them just don't read very well. So this is the bottom 5, plus an honorable mention, and so let's dive in, let's look at them. The first one that I'm starting with is the honorable mention, which is 1965 Topps Transfer. Basically, it's a tattoo, a temporary tattoo. They did a couple of tattoos during this decade, and one of them actually looks pretty decent. But in the case of this one, I'm kind of torn because the trick with a tattoo is, as a collectible, it's always awkward because it's backwards. But also, tattoos are intended to be on the arm. They're actually intended to be on the skin, and that's the way that they're designed. So as a collectible, we get it in not its final form, but just its temporary form. And it looks weird. It's not supposed to look that way. This one actually crosses both of those sides pretty well. It doesn't look too bad in its form here as a collectible, and it's actually well designed for a tattoo. Most of the tattoos that they did at this time were little images. So they had color, and they were intended to be like a flashy image. In this case, it's actually like a tattoo. It's a line drawing of a player. So if you were to get a tattoo, this is really kind of what it would have looked like. And so I have a lot of respect for that, but I also have respect for the fact that in this form, it looks pretty decent. It's backwards. That's annoying. But otherwise, it looks good. Really strong lines, really clear, very well presented. You have the red band at the top and the bottom with the name that's kind of sitting on top of it, so you can't really read it. But for the middle of the card, if it wasn't backwards, it'd look great. So I got to give it props because I certainly don't like it, but I don't at all hate it. I think that it actually is surprisingly good. So I want to give it a nod to it didn't succeed, but it definitely didn't fail. So for the bottom 5, I'm starting off with 1961 Flair Magic Message. And this is a weird one. To me, this is actually more like an honorable mention because this is all over the map. Depending on how I feel, this could be at the bottom of the list or the top of the list, anywhere in the list. An hour from now, when I'm editing this, I may be looking at it trying to figure out why I put it where I did. But for me right now, I'm putting this at 5. I have too much respect for what it was at the time, and I think it looks pretty clean and straightforward. So here's what it is. It is a question and answer. On one side it has a question, on the other side it has a hidden answer. And the way that you get to the answer is you wet the card, and then you let it dry, and then you wet it again. It's a really complex process, and in that way it actually makes it really interesting, because for kids they got to go through a whole chemistry process to try to get to the answer, which makes it kind of fun in a way. And I also like how well it's hidden, because it's not like a coin rub-off where it almost has a cheap quality to merging it. This is right into the fabric of the card, and it really is buried in a way so that it is like a magic discovery. So I like that a lot. I also think that the front of the card is very clean and very professional. If it gets battered up, it looks terrible, but if it's got a clean look to it, it actually looks really nice. All the lines are strong, everything reads well. This is the kind of set where I look at and I'm not interested in it at all, but I would love to have a complete set right there in binder pages, because they would look fantastic. So that's kind of the way that I look at it. Is I've got a lot of respect for the way that it looks, but I also love, more than anything else, I love what it was at the time, because yes, there's the magic discovery side. But also, it's easy nowadays to say, well, they didn't have computers back then, so they couldn't really know they didn't have access to information. But that's not fair, because in the 1980s, when I was growing up, we had access to information as well. We had all sorts of books, and we had programs from games, and there was all sorts of information available to us. But in the early 1960s, they didn't have that. And the 1961 Flair Magic messages are actually for football, which means that these questions are even more challenging, because everybody knew baseball, but in the early 60s, football was still trying to earn its stripes in the American culture. It was still trying to be discovered. And there was very little out there. Sure, you had Pro Magazine, you had Sports Illustrated, you had some magazines that talked about what was going on, but to really get down to the roots of it, there was very little. Every once in a while, a player would retire and then write a book about his time as an athlete, and so you'd have access to that, but there wasn't a lot for kids. And so here in these packs, they had these questions and answers about the game, which gives them a little bit of insight into knowledge about the game. And so I like that. And so that's always one of those elements that hangs over me. And it looks kind of cool for a 1961 insert. So that's why I have this at 5, because I have too much respect for it, and it is a very clean and professional presentation, and it's got a cool quality to how the magic message is actually revealed. For 4, it's in some ways kind of the same, in some ways kind of different, where this is the 1967 Topps, again football, comic pennants. And this, I actually wouldn't have a problem in terms of the very basic rudimentary quality of what this is. It's a well-made sticker that is a pennant of a college team, but it's a play on the words of the name. In this case, it's Naval Academy, where they just spell naval different. If it was just that, I actually would think this is pretty decent. Unfortunately, they put a little image on there, and I think the image, well, I don't like the image. I was never a Mad Magazine kind of person. I was never into Garbage Pail Kids. That kind of thing was never my thing. And so whenever I look at this image, I just think that it's way too much. So I like the idea of what they tried to do. Even though these names are kind of snarky and kind of pushy sometimes, I don't mind that. I look at it and I go, okay, that's not too bad. To me, they don't need the art, and the art kind of pulls it down, but they are very well made, so that also kind of pulls it back up. So for me, I'm leaving this at 4, simply because I don't really have the heart to put it very low. Then we have 1960 Flair stickers, and this is baseball, and in this case, this is kind of a tough one for me, because I think that the art is a little bit too hokey. I think it's really too hokey. It's leaning way too much into kids. I don't think the layout is all that great. It's nice to have like some information or something on it, but to me, this is just something that doesn't age well. This was something that was great for kids in 1960, and now I see no value in it. I don't even see any intrigue in terms of this old thing or this thing for kids. I don't have any of that at all. And these are expensive. This is from virtually almost the first year of Flair doing sports cards. And so these carry a lot of cost, and I can't figure out why. I certainly don't want to pay that money for it, because I think it looks terrible. So that's kind of what I got. Now, I'd love to put this lower, but I got to give a nod to the next two coming up. So that's where this is at. And for number 2, I'm going with 1961 Topps Baseball Rub-Offs. This is another tattoo, and this is a big image, and to me this is a super hokey image. This is really designed for kids. It is supposed to be a flashy joke. If I was, say, 6 or 7 years old, I may love this. I am not 6 or 7 years old. Despite what people may think, I don't love it. I really don't love it. To me, it's backwards. The image isn't very good. The joke to me is too much on the nose. It's too much designed for kids. And so I'm standing here looking at this just going, nah, I'm not interested. That's kind of the way that I feel about it. Which again, I hate to hate on the fact that this is for kids, because to me, cards should be for kids. You're going to hear me a lot in this channel talking about cards are for kids. And if kids aren't involved in cards, what are we doing? We need to make sure that kids are always involved with cards. Now, there are cards specifically designed for kids and cards specifically designed for adults. That's going to be the nature of it. And so I love seeing the things that we do for kids, but there are times where I look and I just go, that I don't need. That's in a whole nother category. And for me, that's what this is. This is something that is just too much for kids for my own taste, and as a collector, I'm just not interested in it. So that's kind of where I put that. Now, the number one for me is 1963 Top Stickers. And this is, to me, it's well made, it's well designed. I just hate what they did. This is a big floating head, and I hate floating heads. I've never understood floating heads. I think it's something from the 50s and the 60s, something that they used to do in that time that just happened to read well. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. It's a bold, weird, awkward image. And then they have this big color patch behind. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that, Darren, you have him here because he plays for the Dodgers. True. That is justification enough to have this as the worst card. But it's not just that. I mean, it really doesn't read well. To me, it is... I don't like it. I hate floating heads. It's well made. It's actually got decent details. It just drives me nuts. So I can't put this anywhere but number one as the worst insert card of the 1960s. But I also acknowledge that, for what it is, it's actually not too bad. But that is basically my list. That's what I've got at this point. And this could change at any time because these are all kind of weird. And that's part of the fun of the 1960s. Now, when we get into the best, now we're getting into some really awesome stuff. And I can't wait to get into that, but that's going to be a little ways down the road. But that's what I have for the worst insert cards of the 1960s. So let me know in the comments below what you think about this. Definitely check out other videos if you haven't done so. And subscribe if you haven't done so as well. And yeah, thank you very much for watching.